Ancient Rome is remembered as one of history's greatest empires, famous for its laws, architecture, roads, and mighty legions. We think of philosophers, brilliant engineers, powerful generals, and breathtaking monuments that still stand today. But beneath this shining image was another reality, one built on endless suffering. Behind the marble temples and golden wealth was a world of backbreaking labor, misery, and cruelty. For millions of people, daily life meant chains, punishment, and work so brutal it would make a modern person shudder. These men and women had no choice. They were forced into tasks that were closer to torture than honest labor. How could human beings survive under such inhumane conditions, where every sunrise brought another day of pain? The truth lies in a system that valued profit and productivity far more than human life itself. And yet, even within this darkness, there were rare moments of tenderness and forbidden love, small sparks of humanity that lit up an otherwise hopeless existence. So let's take a closer look at the hidden side of Roman life. These are the 10 most merciless jobs in ancient Rome. Occupations that reveal the empire's greatness was built on the suffering of millions. Slaves in the mines. One of the harshest and deadliest forms of labor was mining. Roman mines were not just workplaces, they were human grinding machines. They produced the metals that powered Rome's economy, forged its weapons, and built its grand structures. The workers were almost always slaves, prisoners of war, criminals, or the condemned. Once sent to places like Rio Tinto in Spain or the gold mines of Dacia, there was no return. These men and women lived with a status even lower than other slaves, since mining was considered the most dangerous and miserable form of labor. The conditions were horrifying. Tunnels were narrow, dark, and suffocating. Workers had to crawl or crouch for hours in dim lamplight. The air was filled with dust that scarred their lungs and caused deadly illnesses like silicosis. Inside, temperatures could rise to 40-50 degrees Celsius, while humidity made breathing even harder. Shifts lasted 10 to 12 hours, sometimes longer, under the brutal watch of overseers. Using nothing more than primitive picks and shovels, they hacked at stone and carried heavy baskets of ore up slippery ladders to the surface. The death rate was catastrophic. Cave-ins, flooding, poisonous gases, disease, exhaustion, and injury claimed countless lives. The average miner rarely survived more than a few years, sometimes not even a single year. Archaeological digs have uncovered skeletons that confirm these unbearable conditions. To be sentenced to the mines was basically a death sentence, drawn out over weeks or months. For Rome, these slaves were nothing more than expendable resources, sacrificed for the empire's glory and wealth. Gladiators. When we think of Rome, one symbol always comes to mind: the Colosseum. This massive arena, with space for 50,000 spectators, stood as a monument to Roman power. But behind the grandeur was an entire industry of death. At the heart of these bloody spectacles were the gladiators. Known as food for the arena or swords that fight, most gladiators were slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals. Some were condemned to fight wild animals, damnatio ad bestias, others to face execution, ad gladium, or sentenced ad ludum, to be trained and used for the games. They did not choose this life. They were forced into it, trained to fight for survival in front of roaring crowds hungry for violence. For them, every day was lived on the edge of life and death. A gladiator's journey began at a training school, or ludus. The most famous Ludus Magnus stood right next to the Colosseum, connected by an underground tunnel. Here, men were drilled under the strict eyes of a lanista, often a former gladiator or soldier, who taught them to master their assigned weapons and fighting styles, whether as a murmillo, retiarius, or thrax. Training was brutal. Discipline was absolute. Any mistake or lack of effort brought savage punishments, whippings, beatings, or deprivation of food and water. Daily meals, surprisingly, were mostly vegetarian: barley, legumes, and oatmeal. This diet gave them a layer of body fat that helped protect vital organs during combat, prolonging the fight and making it more entertaining for the crowd. Life outside the arena was no less cruel. Gladiators lived in cramped, filthy barracks, locked away like livestock. Their days were filled with pain, fear, and humiliation. Still, even in this hellish world, some sought comfort and intimacy with one another. If such relationships were discovered, the punishment was merciless. Death was always near. A wounded fighter's fate could rest on the crowd or the emperor himself. The gesture of pollis verso, a turned thumb, meant immediate execution, and even those who survived had little chance at freedom. A gladiator often needed to win dozens of battles to earn release, and very few ever did. Most lived short, terrifying lives, destined to die on the sand of the amphitheater, their suffering nothing more than a spectacle for the masses. Galley slaves. If being sent to the mines was a death sentence on land, being chained to a Roman galley was the same punishment at sea. Life as a galley slave was pure torment. Day after day, men sat chained to wooden benches, backs bent, bodies bruised, endlessly pulling heavy oars. They were prisoners of war, criminals or punished slaves, condemned to this slow and torturous death. The environment was unbearable. Under the burning sun or in raging storms, the slaves rode endlessly. Around them, the air stank of sweat, excrement, rot, rats, and disease. Their world was nothing but fear and misery. On these massive ships, discipline was absolute. A slave could not even stand up straight, chained by the leg to his bench. A drummer set the pace and an overseer's whip enforced it. During battles or long voyages, the rowing could continue for 20 hours or more without rest. Food was meager: dry bread, porridge made of beans or millet, and foul water. Rest meant collapsing on the same bench, surrounded by filth and sickness. Hygiene was non-existent. Epidemics of scurvy, dysentery, typhoid, and cholera spread rapidly. Skin infections, festering wounds, and parasites were part of daily life. Punishments were brutal. Overseers, called centuriones, whipped or beat anyone who slowed down. Death was common, from exhaustion, starvation, disease, or direct violence. The dead were simply thrown overboard. Desperate slaves sometimes tried to take their own lives by leaping into the sea or poisoning themselves, but most had no escape. Galley life stripped them of all dignity, reducing them to living machines, rowing until death. Builders Rome's aqueducts, temples, roads, and amphitheaters remain some of the most impressive engineering feats in history. But behind these marvels was endless human suffering. Construction was dangerous, exhausting, and often deadly. The workforce was mostly slaves and poor citizens, forced into harsh manual labor. Building was not just about cutting stone. It meant hauling massive blocks, working high on scaffolds without safety measures, and enduring long hours in all weather. Injuries and deaths were constant, yet Rome continued to build on the backs of the oppressed. For all their genius in design and engineering, the Romans made little effort to ease the suffering of their builders, even though their empire rested on these very shoulders. Why conditions were so brutal? The root cause of this cruelty lies in Rome's economic system, which was built on slavery. With such an endless supply of cheap labor, there was no reason to improve working conditions or invest in machinery. Slaves were considered replaceable, cheaper to exploit than to protect. For the Romans, efficiency came before compassion. If a task could be done with sheer human muscle, no matter how much suffering it caused, that was the path they took. Morality and human dignity were rarely considered, especially for slaves and the poor. Builderstark and the men who built Rome's great monuments paid for those achievements with their lives. Construction workers, mostly slaves and poor plebeians, handled gigantic blocks of stone and marble with nothing but ropes, ramps, and primitive winches. Hundreds of bodies supplied the power needed to move each piece. Work continued under the blazing sun or pouring rain, with no protection from the elements. Safety measures were non-existent. Building aqueducts required working at dangerous heights, where a single misstep meant certain death. Collapsing scaffolds, falling stones, or dropped tools were daily hazards. What makes this even harsher is that the Romans already knew of advanced lifting devices, but they rarely used them on large projects. Why? Because it was easier and cheaper to use hundreds of slaves. The conditions were miserable: no protective gear, poor diets, and endless hours of labor. Broken bones, dislocations, crushed limbs, and fatal injuries were routine. Over time, diseases like arthritis, hernias, and infections destroyed their bodies. Yet overseers had no pity. Anyone who slowed down was beaten without hesitation. Road building was just as relentless. Thousands of kilometers of Roman roads were dug and paved entirely by hand. Workers dug trenches, laid layers of stone, and crushed gravel in the scorching sun with nothing but basic tools. Life for a Roman construction worker was brutally short. Many literally became part of the structures they built, dying on the job, their deaths unnoticed, their bodies replaced by the next wave of forced labor. On these sites, everything was hierarchical. Slave gangs and poor freemen were ruled by overseers who had absolute authority to punish or kill them. Death and accidents were expected and accepted. Instead of investing in safety, Rome simply replaced the fallen. This system was efficient and ruthless, allowing Rome to build quickly, but at the cost of countless broken bodies. Roman engineering, genius wasn't about making life easier. It was about squeezing every last drop of strength from human beings. Still, even in this hell, some slaves found ways to resist or take revenge. How they managed it is a story you'll discover later. Laundry workers, fullones. Rome was famous for its clean clothing and well-maintained fabrics. But few people. Think about who actually kept those garments spotless. The job fell to the fullones or laundry workers, mostly slaves or the poorest free people. Working in a fullonica, a Roman laundry, was among the filthiest and most degrading jobs of all. And the reason was shocking. The main cleaning agent was human urine. Urine contains ammonia, which breaks down grease and dirt. Workers soaked dirty clothes in giant vats filled with it, then stomped on the fabric with their bare feet for hours. The smell was overwhelming, and the liquid caused rashes, sores, and infections on their skin. Afterward, fabrics were bleached using burning sulfur. The fumes were toxic, leading to chronic lung problems, asthma, and eye irritation. Many fullones developed permanent breathing disorders. The physical work was exhausting. Clothes had to be rinsed, pressed, and dried, tasks requiring endless energy in sweltering conditions. Over time, laundry workers suffered constant foot diseases, skin conditions, and chronic pain. The humiliation didn't end with the work. Collecting urine was also part of the job. Special jars were placed on Roman streets, and laundry slaves were tasked with emptying them. The stench clung to their clothes and bodies, marking them as outcasts. Society despised them. Even though their labor was essential, they were seen as filthy and dishonorable. Many were banned from public baths and avoided in social spaces. Life as a fullones wasn't just physically punishing, it was socially crushing. They were despised, isolated, and condemned to live in a world of stench and humiliation. Yet even here, some found comfort in one another. But what happened when their humanity showed through? The reaction of Roman society may surprise you. Sewer cleaners, cloacari. If any job could rival the filth of the laundries, it was that of the cloacari, the sewer cleaners. These men maintained Rome's vast sewage system, including the famous Cloaca Maxima, one of the largest drainage works of the ancient world. Their job was vital for the health of the city, but the work itself was deadly. They spent long hours in dark, cramped tunnels filled with human waste, rotting garbage, and thick layers of silt. Blockages had to be cleared by hand, often while standing knee-deep or even chest-deep in sewage. The air was heavy with poisonous gases like methane and hydrogen sulfide. Many workers died suddenly from suffocation or poisoning. Cave-ins, drowning, or collapsing tunnel walls claimed countless others. Contact with waste brought constant disease. Dysentery, typhoid, parasitic infections, and skin diseases plagued them. Without proper washing facilities, the stench never left their bodies. Society rejected them just as harshly as laundry workers. The psychological toll was crushing too. Imagine spending your life in darkness, knee-deep in excrement, knowing you were despised by the very people who depended on your work. Cloacari lived and died in silence, invisible and unwanted. They were proof that Rome valued sanitation, but not the lives of those who provided it. Bakers, pastores bread, was the cornerstone of the Roman diet. Bakeries, called pistrina, kept the city fed. But behind the warm smell of fresh bread was a world of exhaustion and suffering. Large Roman bakeries were not small shops, but full-scale production centers running day and night. For slaves working there, the labor was unending. The heat was unbearable. Giant stone ovens ran 24 hours a day, pushing the temperature in bakeries to suffocating levels, especially in the summer. Breathing was difficult and dehydration was constant. The physical strain was massive. Dough had to be kneaded in enormous quantities and without machinery. It was done by hand or using crude tools powered by humans, or sometimes donkeys. The endless mixing, lifting, and baking wore down even the strongest bodies. Slaves lived, in stifling conditions, with little food and almost no rest. Accidents with hot ovens, burns, and crushed hands were frequent. What might seem like a simple, humble profession today was, in Rome, a punishing and dangerous sentence. Bakers, pastores, once the dough was kneaded, it had to be cut into pieces, shaped into loaves and placed into blazing hot ovens using long wooden paddles. Every step carried risks. Burns from fire, hot steam, and boiling oil were part of daily life. One mistake could cost a baker his health, or even his life. The air inside bakeries was thick with flour dust. Over time, this dust settled deep into workers' lungs, causing constant coughing, asthma, and serious conditions like silicosis. Combined with extreme heat and backbreaking labor, many collapsed from dehydration, exhaustion, or heat stroke. Shifts often lasted 12 to 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. Few slave bakers lived long lives. Their bodies bore scars from burns and the marks of chronic illness. On top of physical suffering, there was the constant fear of punishment. Every task was supervised. A loaf that burned, a pause for rest, or any slowdown in work could bring lashings or harsher violence. Life for these men and women was a cycle of sweat, pain, and fear. They kept Rome fed, yet they were treated as disposable tools. In the suffocating heat of the bakery, their gaunt, scarred bodies stood as proof that, in Rome, bread mattered
more than human lives. But in such close, suffocating quarters, working side by side day after day, could bonds or even forbidden relationships have developed between them? And how did Roman society react to such things? The answer might surprise
you. Meat was a staple in Roman cities, and feeding such a population required countless butchers. But their trade was brutal. These workers did not simply slice meat for sale. They were responsible for everything from slaughtering animals to preparing the cuts. Strength and a hardened heart were essential. Slaughtering cattle, pigs, sheep, and poultry demanded not only muscle but also a kind of emotional numbness. Day after day they faced blood, death, and suffering. The conditions were appalling. Slaughterhouses were filthy and unhygienic, making disease a constant threat. Workers stood ankle-deep in blood and entrails, swinging axes and knives that frequently caused deep cuts. With no antiseptics or medical care, even small wounds could become deadly infections. The markets, or macella, where butchers worked, were noisy, crowded, and filled with the stench of decay. Flies swarmed the stalls. Rats thrived in the filth. Every butcher carried the smell of blood on his clothes and skin, a stench that marked him as an outcast in polite society. Years of standing, hauling heavy carcasses, and repetitive chopping left them with joint pain, back problems, and countless scars. Skin infections and parasites spread easily in their unsanitary environment. Though their work was essential to Rome's diet, butchers were looked down upon. They were seen as unclean and low class, tainted by their constant contact with blood and death. Their lives were filled with suffering, isolation, and stigma. But surrounded by violence every day, did some butchers develop disturbing forms of intimacy or dominance among themselves or with those they controlled? And what laws did Rome have to deal with such behavior? The truth may shock you. Roman cities needed a constant flow of goods: stone, timber, oil, wine, and even the bodies of the dead. Moving these heavy loads often fell to porters, one of the most humiliating and exhausting professions in the empire. Among them, the most despised were those who carried the dead. sometimes called sarcophagi carriers. These men, usually slaves, or the poorest citizens, hauled corpses to burial grounds outside the city. In the scorching Roman summers, bodies decomposed quickly. Carriers often had to transport remains already bloated or falling apart, with little covering to hide the smell. Citizens avoided them, horrified by their constant contact with decay. Even among slaves, this work was seen as the lowest of the low. The hierarchy of Rome ensured that the most degraded jobs went to those considered least valuable. To be a corpse carrier was to be branded as untouchable, but their duties extended beyond the dead. Porters also moved heavy amphorae of wine and oil, loads of stone, wood, and other materials, always on their backs or with crude stretchers. This relentless lifting destroyed their bodies. Spinal injuries, hernias, and permanent joint pain were inevitable. They worked under the hot sun, or in winter cold, rarely given enough food or rest. Their lives were short and miserable. Every step they took, bent under the crushing weight, reminded Rome that human strength was the cheapest machine of all. But what happened when these men, already treated as little more than beasts of burden, became too broken to work? Did Rome reward their sacrifice or discard them without thought? The answer was as cruel as the empire itself. One of the most feared roles in Roman society wasn't in the mines or the workshops, but in the position of control. The veritores, slave drivers. Their job was not to toil with their own hands, but to ensure that others did. They kept discipline in fields, mines, and construction sites. Their authority came from whips, sticks, and clubs, which they used freely on anyone who slowed down, resisted, or showed weakness. They were the enforcers of Rome's slave system, the link between masters and slaves. Slave owners expected maximum productivity, and veritores made sure to deliver it through cruelty and fear. Many of them were former slaves themselves, promoted for their loyalty and harshness. This created a twisted system where those once beaten now became the beaters. Their power extended beyond physical punishment. They could withhold food, split up families, or torture slaves as examples. And because Roman law gave slaves no rights, veritores could also abuse them sexually, forcing men and women alike into degrading submission. Though they held power and earned privileges, they were despised by both slaves and free citizens. Their lives were filled with tension, feared by those they ruled, distrusted by the masters they served, and hated by society. The constant infliction of pain left deep marks on their own humanity. Many became numb, soulless executioners shaped by the cruelty of the system. They lived with fear of revolt from below and punishment from above if they failed. The veritores were not just overseers of labor. They were symbols of Rome's darkest truth, a system that corrupted not only the enslaved but also those forced to rule them. We've now explored 10 of the harshest professions in ancient Rome. From the endless digging in mines to the brutal life of gladiators, from laundries and sewers filled with stench to the suffocating heat of bakeries, the bloody work of butchers, the exhausting burden of porters, and the cruelty of slave drivers. Behind Rome's greatness lay a system built on suffering. Human lives were spent like coins, and human dignity was stripped away. In the pursuit of power, wealth, and monuments, the empire turned countless people into nothing more than tools. These were not just jobs. They were daily sentences of pain, humiliation, and despair. And yet, through their sacrifice, Rome's grand achievements were made possible. If this look into the hidden side of history has changed the way you see the Roman Empire, make sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video. What part of Roman life would you like us to uncover next? Share your thoughts in the comments. We're always curious to hear from you.